And so the other story from memoirs that I wanted to talk to you about um, ties into this podcast and the reason why I decided to do this podcast. And the story is called The Dirty Little Secret Origin of Comics. So tell me about Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. Tell me about your relationship to him, and uh, tell me about the company that he formed.
Yeah, I mean, I'd always seen his name and thought, like, I wonder if there's some relation. And then it was finally meeting Nikki Wheeler Nicholson and us going through like, oh, I actually am related. And he was in the Army, and he actually led a squadron of people of color and very decorated. And then when he left, he started a comic book company, and it was it's been a while since I've gone through all the history again, but
In a
basically,
nutshell, one of the first comic books to feature original art. Um,
yeah. And the funny thing is that with that is like he was trying to do what other people were doing, but all the best what they were doing is they were reprinting the Sunday comics from the newspaper in comic book form, and he wanted to do that but couldn't because all the best ones had been licensed already. So he had to hire new people, um, and that's when he hired, to do Batman and Superman, and but his printer was also his distributor, and they would print up 20,000 copies or 50,000 or 100,000. He would say, hey, run 20,000 copies. So, and then the guy would print up 100,000 copies, and then they would distribute it, and then he would be told, oh, we didn't really sell that many. And so the printer and distributor then was grifting all the money, or a lot of it. So he's like, I don't understand. It seems like these are selling really well, but he's like, no, they're not. But we'll keep going, and they'll pick up. And then it wasn't until then at some point, I mean, it's interesting because this is right when they'd put a kibosh on selling liquor. And so the mafia and those people then had to go from bootlegging, and they went into pornography, which is what the presses were printing in the daytime, and magazine, basically pornography, and then comic books, and they just saw money in it, and then they took over the whole operation and kicked him out, which then was DC Comics is what it was. That was the
right,
beginning of DC
right.
Comics.
So the printing or the publishing company that he formed was National Allied Publications, which became National Periodicals. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the last comics that were put out by National Allied Publications was Detective Comics, which of course was the first appearance of Batman. I think a
Yep.
little bit after he had been removed from the company, but essentially the comic that he had created, right? The publication that he had
Yeah.
made. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's right. I mean, and it's something. It's such a dirty beginning that it's really been played down in terms of an origin story by DC Comics and everybody, because it's just. But yeah, comics were birthed out of mafia and pornography, um, and not being able to sell booze. And
and
and his storytelling too, like he was wanting to do these adventure stories, and he very much believed in right and wrong, and he had and that's why these stories that were coming out, like the ones that worked, was like Batman, who's fighting for truth and justice, and Superman, that was. So he was organizing and saying, these are the stories that I really want to promote and do, which is then ironic that it gets taken over by bootleggers. um,
so it so the reason why this story struck such a chord with me is because we're going through a period where the most, popular and profitable form of storytelling right now is actually superheroes in movies and TV shows. These huge corporations are mining the IP like they're blood diamonds. Do you know what I mean? Um, and a few years back, I read the Sean Hope book, Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, and I've
Mhm.
always been pretty cynical. But even for as cynical as I thought I was, I guess I always looked back at those early years of Marvel Comics with rose tinted glasses, and or romanticized it in some way. And as it turns out, the industry has always been kind of slimy. It's always been
Yeah.
very, driven by marketers who didn't really care about the product, owned by various companies who didn't really respect the medium, and worked on by guys who, for one reason or another, ended up working in comics probably out of necessity and not necessarily because they loved it. And so signed very short-term contracts, work for hire contracts, even as they were creating these things that we now understand to be billion-dollar properties. Um,
Yeah.
um, so I just and that's essentially. I mean, I think you can hear it from my voice, and I think everyone can hear it from my voice. It sparked this kind of like righteous indignation in me. As somebody who really read comics, not really because I cared that much about what happens to Daredevil, like what's going to happen to Daredevil or Spider-Man or whatever next week, but it was because of the art, it was because of the writing, it was because of the creators, um,
Yeah.
and the creators really just became, you know, grist in the mill. Just, as long as there was ballast to keep the machine moving, they would just move creators in and out. um, and so that's kind of why I wanted to do a podcast where, we don't talk about Superman and Batman as if they're real people and as if these movies are documentaries. You know what I mean? Like, talk about the creators, talk about the process, talk about, their time working in the industry. Treat, because those are the stories that I think are the most important. I think those are the stories that people need to hear.